This one is just called Tuffy. He was just a little ball of gray and white fur when Barb and I first saw him. He looked up at us through the wire cage at the pound with those sad yet hopeful eyes that only a puppy possesses. There were many pups and dogs, of course, many of which would eventually have to be destroyed because no one would take them. We went through the momentary guilt that all animal lovers do for not adopting all of them, but there was something different about this puppy. From the moment we laid eyes on him, we turned and looked at each other, and both of us just knew. The folks at the pound told us that it would be 3 more days before we could take him home. He'd been found wandering the streets of Lexington, and they had to hold him to see if he would be claimed. So for the next 2 mornings, at the insistent urgings of my loving wife, I called the pound to make sure that no one had claimed him. On the 3rd morning, the lady at the pound assured us that the puppy was fine and had not been claimed. He was visiting. Seems the pound would loan some of their puppies to the hospital once a week to help cheer up some of the patients, and our puppy would be back in by that afternoon, at which time we could pick him up. Now, the drive to Lexington that day seemed interminable, but at last he was settled in Barb's lap for the ride home. I remember those eyes, frightened at first, but quickly turning to trust. Barb has that effect on animals. People, too, come to think of it. After a few abortive tries with names, we settled on Tuffy. Now, Tuffy did his best to show his gratitude from the very start. He got car sick before we'd gone more than 5 blocks, and to protect that cardboard box we provided for him, he crawled out of it and proceeded to throw up on the seat of the car. Expecting to be punished, he cowered, but Barb simply put him back in her lap, and soon he was licking her hand and all was well with the world. Tuffy became an instant member of our extended family, making a hit with the kids and with my dad. There were many things which endeared him to us. Dad indicated that when we were gone, Tuffy would follow at his footsteps from room to room, his constant companion, never understanding why he couldn't come into the bathroom as well. He would also jump into one of our laps while we were watching TV and proceed to go to sleep. I guess TV just wasn't intellectually challenging enough. What never ceased to amaze us, though, was the fuss he would make over our return. The moment we walked through the door, he would jump, he would bark, he would race around the room in the most frantic welcome I have ever experienced. We may have only been gone for a few minutes, but you would have thought it was 6 months. Those welcome home frolics never ceased to amuse us and warm our hearts. He grew into a lovable 2/3 sized Benji, long scraggly hair over his eyes, short legs, and boundless energy. Tuffy wasn't perfect, however, and neither is Mother Nature. You know, I once saw a hawk fly straight into the side of a tree. Now, I don't know whether he was distracted, suffering from a hangover, or perhaps using a cell phone at the time, but for whatever the reason, he hit that tree like the proverbial ton of bricks. I thought at first it had killed him. He lay at the base of the tree, feathers still floating down around the disheveled tangle of wings and body. But a few minutes later, addled though he was, he managed to get on his feet, and a few minutes after that he took to wing. Do you suppose hawks suffer from embarrassment? I wondered if he flew back to his buddies saying something like, "Hey, I meant to do that. Really." I smiled to think of the old adage about southern rednecks. They say if a southern redneck says, "Hey, y'all, watch this," better get out of his way because it'll probably be the last thing he ever utters. Redneck hawks. Now there's a concept. Well, anyway, back to Tuffy. He got along with just about everybody except the neighbor's cat. Now this was an older cat, large and self-assured. She was the queen of her domain, and she largely ignored the young upstart next door. He considered it great sport to bark and growl and otherwise make bluff with threatening gestures. She would simply stare at him a moment, as if in utter disbelief that this raucous member of the common proletariat should be allowed to disturb her royal court. Then her imperial majesty would flip her tail and wander away at her own pace, dismissing the barking dog from sight and mind. So was achieved a sort of Mexican standoff. Tuffy got to bark and parade around as long as he didn't actually enter her domain. I was out working in a flower bed one morning when, for whatever the reason, Tuffy decided to violate the demilitarized zone. He was really excited that morning, so I guess he may have just been overcome with exuberance, for his charge, which usually ended right at the edge of the neighbor's yard, did not stop there on this morning. Instead, he charged across the line of demarcation and straight at that cat. The feline retreated a step or two before regaining her royal composure and proceeded to stand her ground, hair raised straight up on her back, claws extended, and phew, that sound that only an agitated cat gone to the attack mode can. When the realization struck him that the cat was not going to run but rather fight, Tuffy began putting on the brakes. He resembled one of those cartoon dogs on a wet floor, backpedaling for all they're worth but unable to stop in time. Such it was that Tuffy barreled right into that cat at near full speed. Now the cat came up fighting and Tuffy came up running. Funny how animals have also mastered that line, discretion is the better part of valor. Now, Tuffy, being new to this, being the chasee, was paying far too much attention to where he was escaping from instead of where he was escaping to. The neighbors had a storage shed, and Tuffy, running as fast as his little legs would carry him, head turned back toward his pursuer, plowed right into the side of that shed. Completely addled, he dropped like a rock. The cat, with a sort of "that'll teach you," sidled back onto the neighbor's back porch. As funny as the whole episode had been, I was concerned that he might actually be seriously injured. Pride doesn't count in situations like this. Before I could approach him, however, he wobbled to his feet and looked at me. I swear there was a look of embarrassment on his face, but even more telling was the fact that his eyes were crossed. Over the next few minutes they returned to normal, but from that day forward, Tuffy never violated the no-fly zone again. Several months later, Tuffy was hit by a car. He wasn't killed, but his neck was broken. I remember finding him along the road by our house. He looked up at me with a look that said, "I'm sorry." We took him to the vet, who first told us he would have to be euthanized. We agonized over letting him go, but in the end decided it would be selfish to hang on to him when he was in such pain. Yet when we called to give the vet permission, he related that additional x-rays indicated a small chance that surgery might be successful. The surgery was done in Cincinnati, and before long Tuffy was again as healthy and happy as ever. His eventual downfall was his womanizing. We had intended to have him neutered, but had never quite gotten around to it. So Tuffy would periodically leave us for a couple of days at a time, eventually wandering back in, bedraggled and exhausted, but if it's possible for a dog, with a smile on his face. Some new neighbors moved in up the street, nice folks. Problem was, they had a registered female Sheltie and felt that Tuffy, being of questionable parentage at best, showed far too much interest, especially at certain times of the year. They eventually built a pen to keep her in while she was in heat. Tuffy jumped the fence. They built the fence higher. Tuffy dug under the fence. So when the first litter of Sheltie Tuffies came along, our relationship with our new neighbors became a bit strained. Several months later, the neighbors called to inform us that their dog was again in heat and would we please restrain our exuberant canine adolescent. We agreed to do what we could, but one night Tuffy didn't come when called. The neighbors telephoned to report that their little princess was missing, having been freed by a burrowing intruder whose description fitted Tuffy all too well. I agreed to help hunt for the missing dogs. It was getting late when I found him. He'd been hit and killed by a car. No doubt while in pursuit of his lady friend. The Sheltie came home the next day. It's been 10 years since I buried Tuffy on the hill behind our house. We now have 2 wonderful collies, and they're such loving companions, but sometimes my thoughts go back to Tuffy and to the love and joy and laughter that he brought to us. I wonder about that rascal in his final night on earth. I surely hope he checked out with a smile on his face.